Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I'm really thankful to the organizers for putting this together and letting me come here and present my work after working here for 2 years. It's nice to return. So yes, I will talk about, I'm aware I will talk about something that is quite contentious in feminist circles. So I'm also looking forward to your comments and critiques. And the title is, as has been mentioned, The Body is Obstacle or Nature as Unjust. I will be talking about somatophobia, but I was thinking an alternative title of this talk could also be Beauvoir, like Firestone, is also a xenofeminist before her time. I'm echoing here an article of Vicky Margret on Shulamit Firestone, and I will explain in a bit what I mean by this. So this talk is not, it's in the panel on violence, but it's linked to violence in a rather metaphorical way. What I will be talking about are embodied experiences that are that can be experienced as violent in themselves. By this I mean mostly disruptive of subjectivity and agency in a markedly negative sense. And I will be talking or hinting to actions upon one's body that can or have been sometimes thought about as violent, as being, let's say, legitimate, sometimes necessary from a feminist perspective. So I will start by reminding you or hinting to, pointing to the points in The Second Sex, written by Simone de Beauvoir, and The Dialectic of Sex, that have been most famously considered to be somatophobic, that is indicative of a certain hatred of bodies, and especially feminist bodies, and therefore also sometimes they have been taken to be misogynistic, male identified, and so on, by feminists. I mean, I'm not talking about, of course, sexist readings, which I'm not really interested in, but feminist readings of these works. So in the chapter Biological Data, Beauvoir famously writes, and I quote, "Woman experiences an even stronger alienation." Here it's meant even stronger than in menstruation. So she experiences an even stronger alienation when the fertilized egg drops into the uterus and develops there. Gestation is, of course, a normal phenomenon that is not harmful to the mother if normal conditions of health and nutrition prevail. Certain beneficial interactions develop between her and the fetus. However, contrary to an optimistic theory that is so obviously useful socially, gestation is tiring work and offers woman no benefits as an individual, but demands serious sacrifices. In the early months, it often brings with it appetite loss and vomiting that is not observed in any other domestic female and shows the body's revolt against the species taking possession of it. A bit later on, she says, childbirth itself is painful. It is dangerous. And then breastfeeding is also an exhausting servitude. The breastfeeder feeds the newborn to the detriment of her own strength. The conflict between the species and the individual can have dramatic consequences in childbirth, making the woman's body distressingly fragile. One often hears that women have belly aches. True indeed. A hostile element is locked inside them. The species is eating away at them. End of quote. This all comes from page 42 in my version of The Second Sex, and it's only one example of this kind of interpretation of reproductive processes. Even more infamous, perhaps, was Shulamit Firestone's echo of Beauvoir's analysis of reproduction in her 1969 book, The Dialectic of Sex, where she talks about women's role in reproduction as an enslavement of the species, and she stages an ingenious talk or dialogue between a friend of hers who has just given birth and what she calls the school of the great experience. When the latter attempts to extract from the newly become mother a confession that pregnancy and giving birth have been worthwhile experiences, this newly become mother says, convinced, no, so yes, it was painful. No, it wasn't fun. No, it wasn't interesting. I'm paraphrasing here. not quoting. And then she says it was like shitting a pumpkin, and this is a quote. A pumpkin that now, after it has come to the world, through parenting, this newly become mother can mess up as she pleases. So these descriptions and interpretations of the process of human reproduction have been decried, of course, by sexist reactions to the two authors as who have been branded as unnatural and crazy. But as I have gestured, also feminists have considered them misogynistic, male-identified, and somatophobic. What is important to note is that this category is not applied, which sounds actually like a psychiatric category or a psychoanalytic category, is not applied only to their descriptions of reproduction, which I have quoted here because they're particularly colorful, but it refers to their broader theoretical, philosophical, let's say, the infrastructure of their thought that is taken to be somatophobic for several reasons. In the case of Beauvoir, it has been argued that her notion of transcendence, so she operates with the existentialist concepts of transcendence and immanence that she develops in her own way, and it has been argued that her understanding of transcendence as entailing meaningful projects often or almost always means a kind of transcending of the most bodily aspects of one's existence, like reproduction, reproducing one's life also in a broader sense, as in eating, sleeping, and so on. Whereas, and that what she conceptualizes as transcendence, meaningful projects, mostly have to do with endeavors of the mind or actions in the world. And in the case of Firestone, Firestone has been considered somatophobic also because she conceives more broadly of all bodily dependencies as potential sites of oppression. So she talks about how the human reproductive process makes children dependent upon their mothers, biological mothers, I mean, in the early stages, and upon adults more broadly, and people giving birth and gestating dependent upon the broader environment, social environment, and that this is a kind of occasion for oppression to take place. And she tends to see autonomy from these kinds of dependencies as the result or the goal of feminist liberation. So this has also been considered as somatophobic in that the bodily aspects of our being that make us dependent are seen as negative. So subsequent feminist scholarship has sought to defend the two authors. In relation to Beauvoir, it has been argued that even her chapter, Biological Data, and not just the second part of the second sex called Lived Experience, in fact, gives voice to women's reproductive experiences in patriarchal conditions. Is everything okay?
Too big.
Okay. Okay. Yes, so that Beauvoir gives voice actually to women's experiences in patriarchal conditions, that it is the patriarchal setting of their carrying out reproductive tasks that makes for their alienating, dangerous, painful, suffering quality. Whereas for Firestone, it has been claimed that her incendious wording of or condemnation also of reproduction has to do with a kind of reaction to romanticization and myths about motherhood as something benign, as something nice, something that brings women, let's say, meaning into their lives and so on. So I partially, of course, agree with these readings. I think Beauvoir and Firestone both offer very good resources for critiquing myths of motherhood, kinds of romanticization of women's roles, and the ways in which the kind of constant expectation for women to fulfill those roles renders their fulfillment, let's say, something less joyous than it could be. But here in this contribution, I want to talk about something else and explore the possibility that when they depict these processes, reproductive processes, but also, as I have mentioned more broadly, bodily aspects of our being in negative terms, what they're talking about are actual adversities, dangers, kinds of pain, suffering, disgust, and alienation that may arise from certain bodily processes, from certain bodily aspects of our being, including gestation and parturition, and that not only in patriarchal, oppressive social contexts, although those contexts, I think, really magnify the suffering and that comes from these experiences. So I explored this second reading, and I think this reading can have two merits, or is important, or can be important for two reasons. And one is intra-theoretical. I think viewing this kind of somatophobia as giving expression to actual real adversities in human embodiment can function as a good, let's say, theoretical toolbox to think about matter and nature and body in a realist sense, which has been, let's say, an important task for feminist philosophy and theory, in especially lately. But to think of those as both not determining, but at the same time not something that should simply be affirmed and celebrated, as it happens sometimes in some feminist theories. And I will say more about this later. The second, let's say, the second advantage of this perspective is, I think, that it enables us to theorize some embodied experiences that are often or have been often left out from feminist theorizing, and which approaches to the body, including the female body, as only and exclusively something to be celebrated. Let's say they render it much more difficult to make sense of these experiences or be theorized. And these are some forms of disability, chronic pain, then some forms of trans embodiment, and gestation and parturition as a form of labor in the broadly Marxian sense, and not as a natural function. Yes, so to see why viewing somatophobia in Beauvoir and Firestone as expressive of actual adversities, dangers, pain, and disgust in bodies and embodied experiences, I will offer now a brief intellectual history of feminist engagements with bodies. So the kind of contemporary, very widespread body positivity and body acceptance attitude, I think, has been in fact prevalent in feminist theory and philosophy for over half a century, more or less. We all love bodies is in a way the kind of thing that we are all supposed to embrace as feminists. We are our bodies already, Beauvoir wrote that. And kind of embracing bodily aspects of our being, both theoretically, so theorizing them, and in a normative sense, so as something positive, as something to be celebrated, is seen as feminist par excellence. A kind of very contemporary expression of that, a very quite philosophically radical expression, I think, can be found in Cambridge philosopher Claire Chambers' book Intact, in defense of the unmodified body, where she makes an argument in favor of celebrating bodies as good enough, accepting them without modification, unless the modification is strictly medically necessary. And I think I find this quite a dangerous argument, because it can result in a normative condemning of many more cyborgian interventions into the body of trans feminist modifications of bodies and so on. This kind of celebration of the body is, as I said, like a kind of extreme example. But in fact, since the 70s, more or less, feminist theory and philosophy has started to revalue bodily aspects of our beings, of human existence, so that all views that view the mind and the body as distinct are denounced as dualist, and are implied as implying a hierarchy between mind and body. French difference feminists like Kristeva, Irigaray, and Cicigoj have been famous for revaluing, let's say, bodily aspects of female embodiment, especially through concepts like the cora, the mechanics of fluids, and so on. Feminist new materialisms today are an example. They also draw upon this body of work, and they are an example, I think, of this kind of lineage that denounces dualisms and embraces nature and the body as something inherently changeable, something that brings change, and a kind of feminist liberation in itself. I can't help but being a kind of feminist killjoy within feminist theory and philosophy, and I have argued against both, in a way, bodies of work. To sum up what I have tried to say is that seeing nature and the body as inherently a site of becoming, a site of liberation, has some pitfalls, and one of them is that intentional collective action and political change is delegated to nature. And the other is that precisely what I am trying to emphasize today, that the more adverse aspects of embodiment are eclipsed from view and from theorizing. Because of those pitfalls, I propose to pay attention to what in Beauvoir and Firestone has been seen as somatophobic. And in conclusion, I will say a few things about how this kind of somatophobic aspects of their work can be and has been rendered productive for feminist philosophy and theory. One thing that I find quite interesting is the work of Susan Wendell on disability and the transcendence of the body. This is the last chapter of her book on the feminist philosophy of disability. And in that work, Susan Wendell does not explicitly talk about Beauvoir or Firestone, but I think, and her concept of transcendence of the body also has not a technical existentialist meaning. However, I think it in many ways resonates with Beauvoir's understanding of transcendence, which, as Eva Lundgren-Gothlin has also emphasized, has something of the Hegelian distinction between taking and risking life against keeping and reproducing life. So Wendell argues that in certain conditions of chronic pain and disability, a kind of attitude that attempts to transcend one's body, to bracket one's bodily experience so that one may focus upon other things, is actually what is most, in a way, productive and life-affirming, if you want. So she argues against also the kind of dogma in feminist theory and philosophy that all aspects of one's embodiment need to be embraced and paid attention to. Another very interesting reading in this sense is Alexander Antonopoulos' article in the Blackwell Companion to Simone de Beauvoir, where they propose to find a transmasculine embodiment in Beauvoir's chapter on biology. So they argue that where she talks about the adversity that she talks about women, that women experience in regard to their embodiment may be seen as the expression of a transmasculine experience of error, so of seeing one's body as an error compared to what one would like to be or to have, and thus grounding also kind of intervention into one's embodiment. Firestone herself has, although she has a kind of binary sex gender framework, has been taken up a lot by recent trans and queer feminists. And I think this is precisely because she takes the same kind of anti-naturalist framework that Beauvoir has, or develops it, and enables us to see the body and nature as something upon which human beings can act upon and can take a antagonistic let's say, relationship to, and not as something that has to be accepted. I would propose that both, in fact, both Beauvoir's and Firestone's somatophobia speak of a philosophical stance that I find very important, that philosopher and feminist theorist Lena Gunnarsson has called a Marxist or dialectical realism in her article on feminist new materialism. And for this stance, the concept of emergence is crucial, so that two or more entities can be understood as distinct without being completely separate. For instance, the body and consciousness, nature and culture, humans and non-humans, and something can emerge from something else without being reducible to it. For instance, the subjectivity from the body, or humans from nature, or culture from nature. Sorry, and this entity can also act back upon from what it emerges, like human beings on their own environment or on their own nature. So, as I mentioned, I find this kind of philosophical stance very productive for contemporary feminist theorizations of at least some experiences of disability, some experiences of trans embodiment, and for conceptualizing gestation and giving birth as labor, and grounding political claims for better working conditions of reproductive laborers, including an appropriate compensation and a safe environment to carry out those activities. Yes, I will stop here because I see that I'm already over time. Thank you.